The Sleepy Bones Detective Agency presents Should We Just Kill All the Vampires? Episode 1. Should we? It is the doldrums of 2008. A confidential convocation has been called on the antisocial island of Nomis Grimarsi, home to the witches of Sinise Nix and all of their secrets. A meeting place, a kind of semi-neutral ground, has been drafted from blatant nothingness and slotted sideways into one of the Isle's many grand stone towers, a new annex amongst the archive. As a room, it is bare, except for an oversized wooden table and several near-identical chairs. There is not even a door, unless a witch wills one. Few are in attendance for what is, undoubtedly, a matter of extinction. Of the 7 divinely empowered, there are only 4 present members of the 8th Intrinsic Council, the all-seeing governing body of which kind. Thanatos Mercy, Tartarus Abdul, Metis Saskia, and Pallas Victoria. Having changed from their battle dress to more formal regalia, the members of the council are wearing similar but not matching robes. Each has a subtle celestial glow radiating from their visible flesh, as though not even their immortal bodies can contain the multitudinal energies gifted to them by their creator god. Behind their heads float halos of a matching colour, almost as crowns to their own demi-divinity. Seated lengthways across the long left side of the mahogany table, each council member is flanked by their own uniformed guard dogs, soldiers of the If All Else Fails initiative, the magical military who stand straight in singed and stained fatigues. On duty, and whilst in the view of the public, they retain their anonymity by wearing black, whole-head leather masks with short beaks and glass eye shields illuminated a menacing red. What skin can be seen around the wrists and neck is covered in geometric tattoos, a classic signifier of a witch's presence, done in a rare and powerful kind of ink. Without these magic circles, regular incantation is difficult at best. To the uninitiated, the limp hands at their side may appear bare, unarmed, and ill-prepared, but it is not weaponry at which the witches excel, is it? Across the table stands another pair of IAEF soldiers, who hold intersecting ceremonial staves across the chest of a handcuffed prisoner. A man who wears a handmade tunic sopped in blood of 2 colours. Primarily, it is red, but at his breast it blends with the blue blood from his own veins to create a vivid purple stain. Despite this, there is not a scratch on his ash-grey skin. This prisoner, who has surrendered by his own free will, is guilty of beginning a war that he could not see through to its grim end. A smile is strapped to his face, and he has not let it drop since arriving on the closed island. Wide-mouthed, like a pit bull in a desert. His tongue, too, is blue, and his grin bears fangs, for this prisoner is what's known as a saint-borne vampire. In fact, as of 2 days ago, he is the king of all shade dwellers. Had he not suffered a significant blow to the side of the head delivered by military commander Pallas Victoria, he would likely still be wearing his helm, which was built from the turquoise bones of his predecessor. He waits, patient as time itself, for the trial of words to begin so that he can stake his claim, though on what remains the question of the hour. To the north, Reclining between the warring parties is Aoife Sheridan, a private investigator known in certain circles as Strangelove, most often in all capitals. Aoife looks 25, but she is no spring chicken, about now approaching her 224th birthday. Her tongue is as sharp as it is pitch black, for she has long since replaced her blood with the witch's special ash-bearer ink. She, by this point in her career, longs to be rid of the witches and their nonsense. She has helped them, and she has learned from them, but it is maybe time to move on for a while. By no means is Aoife a natural-born practitioner of the Nixian arts, but she has lived and worked amongst their society since the dawn of the 80s as their own personal crime watchdog. At least, that's how the idea was originally pitched to her. But here, on Nomis Grimarsi Island, investigation often takes a back seat to simply fist-fighting criminals of a magical persuasion for stolen goods. This situation was much to the same tune, evident if only by the fact that Aoife was currently regrowing a leg from the hip down, an ability afforded to her by her own paranormal circumstances. Classified a cambion, Aoife Sheridan shares her body with a parasite of the soul, or, according to the witches, a once-lost piece of the human psyche, known to all as a remnant. In harmony, two entities existed physically as one whole, Aoife Sheridan and Naberius. It allowed her certain liberties, including self-repair and the ability to see a person's whole lifespan by ingesting a piece of them. It was a difficult thing to explain to a stranger, and so she did not often bother. It rendered her immortal, to an extent, though that did not mean that losing a limb didn't suck shit. Opposing the intertwined sits another injured individual. A chap presumed old by the colour and length of his beard. He is ballpark 68 and is wearing a similarly aged beige trench coat and leather hat combination. He is also wholly human, the least interesting of the Earth's fauna. In the preceding battle, he'd lost his right forearm and it was not going to grow back on its own. He has already cleaned, cauterized and covered it, and that was the best he could hope for, really. Eduardo Kresnik was his name, designating him a surviving member of the Kresnik vampire concern, a traditionally generational legion of so-called vampire hunters that, in truth, had not had much to do since the vampire crisis of 1761, which, probably, would soon be known as the first vampire crisis. Evidence suggests that this outright fact has not stopped the Kresnik bloodline from preparing for this day. Eduardo was brought to the front by the whim of Métis Saskia, the only member of the council who had not intentionally forgotten about the Kresnik family after their fountain of usefulness had run dry. And the final, most important frontline player in this game of conversation is laying across the table in total, inanimate silence. It is an object of desire that, to all who sit around it, was once lost on purpose by the famed former Kronos Rani, matriarch of the 5th Intrinsic Council. It is the very literal heart of Sinis Nix. It is a piece of their one true god. It appears on the surface to be nothing more than a jagged bulb of coal, naturally patterned with the complex hexagonal structure of a honeycomb. It is sleeping at the moment. It will remain this way for another hour or so, as it has recently been used. There are 11 artifacts of Nyx, so say the witches. There's even a wee little saying, 5 in pride, 6 in greed. In death, the witch's womb, Sinis Nix, gifted his creations a crown, an eye, a maw, a cestus, and a heart. And from the rest of his corpse, the witches chose to craft 6 more in the form of rings. Aoife Sheridan had stood beside former Kronos Rani as she sealed away their power with a charm and scattered them somewhere beneath the flesh of Mother Earth for safekeeping. It was widely believed that they would never again work their magic, though the saint-borne vampires had now proven that theory to be untrue. The heart of Sinis Nix was the most important, though. Not only was it the key to the vampire plot, but it was capable of the most unpreventable destruction. In truth, it would have surprised Aoife quite so had it never resurfaced in her unending lifespan. In the world of the witches, a Kronos has no equal, but in the grand scheme of things, the world of the witches was minuscule, and Sinis Nix did not belong to it. It belongs to him. It is unknown if the effects of the artifacts were intended as a gift, or if they were a simple, fortunate accident of deific flesh containing the essence of its host. The heart, for example, could grant truth to any one wish a person could fathom. It was capable of altering even the most stringent of universal properties with little to no sentient resistance. It comes at a cost, however, and, as such, its miraculous changes have rarely been incorporated in this Indio reality. Those who desire a change so deep must will it enough to never experience such a boon, for their soul shall be forfeit to the embellisher of calamity, and their body shall be reduced to bone. Taking first charge of the floor is Thanatos Mercy, the incumbent incarnation of necromantic magic. In a glue-grey swivel chair, she sits cross-legged with perfect posture. Of the 4, she is the tallest, and the only one wearing any jewellery. Although intrinsic witches lack the physical ability to become tired, her eyes are so underscored by dark circles that she appears to be jet-lagged at all times. Mercy's permanent aura is the faintest shade of mauve, and as she gestures, it dyes the air around her painted white fingernails for just a moment. Her hair is housecat ginger, tied in a tight bun. A single, rusty strand tickles the side of her face as she speaks. The heart of Sinis Nix was last used approximately 70 hours ago, according to the testimony of the king of the saint-borne vampire. She is cut off, almost immediately, by Aoife, who pipes up from in-between winces to shout, "Objection!" All who are present turn to face her, and all but the king of vampires and those wearing masks are scowling at her. With the full attention of the room, Aoife shuffles her wounded self into a better position. By now, her blasted leg is halfway regenerated, but still sort of oozing the expensive black goo that circulates her body, shifting bone down to the ankle, swarming meat up to the knee. "Will you please use this fucking Dracula's goddamn name? King. Pah!" she spits. "He's no king here." There is a bit of a pause. "Huh," says Mercy. "What with all the fighting, I was hesitant to ask anybody, but what is his name?" Then turning to the bloodsucker himself, she redirects the question. "Not a great start, huh, Vicky?" says Aoife to the Pallas who is seated closest to her. "Do not start, Strangelove," says Pallas Victoria, the manifestation of war magic, and the only witch in the room who still wears the classic wide-brim pointed hat like a walking, talking stereotype. A constant grimace is displayed on her face, set below a hard-cut, shaggy blonde bob. It was a surprise that she had any teeth left, given how often they were grit together like cemented bricks. Her narrowed eyes are encased in a fog of heavy eyeshadow, which was certain to be made from the same ash-bearer ink flowing through Aoife's veins. If I had my way, you would not even be here. You are the opposite of impartial at the best of times. In return, Aoife sticks out her dyed tongue and tells the palace to, quote, wind her neck in a bit. Neither of them had gotten along since the early 90s, but there was something uniquely fresh about Victoria's attitude regarding this particular meeting, as Aoife's status as Cambion was well known to be the fault of a certain sect of these vampires. It was difficult to recall exactly why they'd been fighting for so long. Aoife had been alive for much longer than she was supposed to have been, and she was beginning to run out of space upstairs for memories, making sweating the small stuff just a little harder. A baseless grudge, however, took up little room whatsoever, and made day-to-day life just that little bit more interesting. With a flip of the bird, Aoife is done. For the record, smiles the vampire, I am called Norman. Norman Cra. Nope, not done. Aoife breaks out into a snort, and her cheeks puff up in an attempt to catch the heinous noise that escapes her hollow chasm. Norm? That's your name? Are you fucking kidding me? Cram it, Aoife, snaps Victoria, her golden glow crackling like a firework as she suppresses her anger as best as possible. People died today. People die every day, mortal or not. We're sitting with a Dracula called Norman, she squeaks through rapid burst-fire laughter. How are you not laughing? Hi, I'm Norman the Vampire. Would you mind so much if I were to partake in a smidgen of your blood there a little? Oh, you would? Never mind, eh? Fucking leeches. Jesus Christ, says Victoria. Aoife, this is no place for your grudge. Put a sock in it or leave. Make me. That is enough, bellows Tartarus Abdul, the current embodiment of remnant magic, a heavily bearded man of supercharged muscle, approximately the size of two others bound at the waist. He is the eldest member of the current council, edging now into his 4th century, though his appearance is now frozen until his tenure is up. He was beginning to bald before he was chosen. Now, he is stuck with a clear night reverse eclipse of a haircut. It is evident that he waxes his dome for posterity, as it reflects the leaf green smolder humming off his skin. While some are able to hide it better than others, there is nobody in this room that does not fear this man who could, without exaggeration, punch a hole clean through a person. Mercy, he says, in a calmer, more reserved tone. Continue. I will allow for no further distractions. The Thanatos, perhaps disguising a smile of her own, covers her mouth and unnecessarily clears her throat. According to the testimony of Norman Cra, vampire, the heart of Sinis Nix was last used by his predecessor, known as Clive the Remorseful. Another pause is taken, as Aoife Sheridan is just about able to stifle her laughter. Mercy continues onwards to the end of her sentence. For what purpose was the heart used, Norman? The King of Vampires offers this information willingly, for the question is simply an indication that the trial now takes place. His answer is known throughout this room, evident in the broken bodies of 165 dead witches. The Remorseful wished for strength to return to our kinsman, he says, without dropping the smile. It was the only meaningful act of his entire insignificant life. We have gone hungry for the longest time. I knew that our use of the heart would not go unnoticed. If we could not defend ourselves, all would be for naught. If I am to be honest, I believed that simple possession of the item would be enough to alert your kind to our plot. Is it not the case that one of you can see all possible futures? This was indeed a fact. Time itself is the domain of the Intrinsic Council's leader, the crowned Kronos. All intrinsic witches were as powerful as the lesser gods, but none were as omniscient as those who had earned unadulterated access to the indigo pools of energy encapsulating reality as it was known to the witches. Being Kronos permitted knowledge of all things that can and may come to fruition, but even they could not be everywhere at once. In fact, in all of Aoife's memory, the bearer of the title had chosen not to intervene in all but 2 circumstances, all in the name of free will. The 8th Kronos, Marnie, is not present at this meeting and therefore cannot defend herself or her actions. Instead, it is Métis Saskia, the personification of material magic, who acts to preserve the witches in statement as semi-divine beings. It is no crime to hold the heart of Sinis Nyx. It is no crime to use the heart either, says Tartarus Abdul, playing devil's advocate. Aoife pipes up. Whose side are you on anyway? Sinis Nyx bestowed his gifts for a reason, adds Thanatos Mercy. Yeah, says Aoife. A reason that none of you actually know. Aoife, quiet, barks Victoria, again. But it was you who declared war, vampire, continues Abdul. In dealing death to Tartarus Llewellyn of the Fourth, your kinsman forced our hand. You know well that it was the decree of the Fourth Intrinsic Council to gift you that island, to isolate you from the mortals. And with that action, you became our responsibility until the end of time. For the first time, the vampire drops his smile and closes his mouth. Rather choice words, which, he snarls, as though choking on the words themselves. Gift. The Isle Caligo was no gift, it was a prison. Responsibility. You left us alone with nothing to feed on besides ourselves, with no way to sustain ourselves. It was hell on earth. 247 years spent thinning, wasting away, but never able to die. Aoife Sheridan knew that this was hyperbole. Offhand, the detective knew of a few ways to do the deed herself, for no immortal was truly unkillable. Option A. You could cut out the heart or lop off the head, providing that you burn all pieces of the corpse, lest they find a way to reattach themselves. Option B. You might pierce their flesh at the thickest point with a crystal stake of bound sea salt. Option C. You would be better off, though, eviscerating the entire vampire from head to toe with some kind of explosion, rendering what was once skin and bone ash. None of these options amounted to a true death to Caligo's legion. As far as the saint-borne vampires were concerned, there was only one way for their kind to rest in peace, and that was to step into the light of the sun. It was unlike anything from the stories or the folk tales, though. A vampire who walks themselves into the daytime's basking is obliterated not only from life, but from the memories of all living beings too. It is as though the dead never once existed. That to the shade waltzers was an honourable passing, and a right bestowed upon them by their patron saint, aoife. All possibility of such an end was revoked after the first vampire crisis of 1761. In that year, the aforementioned Thanatos Llewellyn created the Isle Caligo out of wet sand and rock from beneath the Timor Sea, given buoyancy by Nyx's will. It was a cursed land, untouchable by the indescribable lightness of morning, purpose-built to house eternal twilight. It was never, according to all viable literature, intended to be any kind of prison, but instead a sanctuary for their kind, from which they would never again turn the mortal world into a feeding trough. The current Intrinsic Council had little to say about the matter. As far as they were aware, the former Thanatos had made blood and other necessities available in the form of livestock, but with that said, it was unknown to all who last checked on the Isle's condition. In all likelihood, it was Llewellyn himself, probably on the eve of its creation. Aoife Sheridan's own thought was that the witches were their own special breed of bastard at the best of times, and this was not the best of times. It was, in fact, the Dickensian opposite. Mercy speaks, in order to break the awkward silence of hot shame, if the council even felt shame. For what purpose did former Thanatos Llewellyn return to the Isle Caligo 3 days ago? What else? He sought forgiveness for his transgressions, says the vampire, to which Saskia tilts her head like a lost cat. I know. A rare trait for your kind, but I have no reason to lie to you here. He brought us the heart as a gift. And why did you choose to kill him? Asks Mercy, leaning closer, perhaps already knowing the answer. He did not deserve forgiveness. How did you do it? Asks Aoife, a question bookended by the sound of necks snapping in her direction for a second time. What? Don't look at me like that. It ain't an easy job, killing a witch. Aoife Sheridan, started Victoria. If I have to tell you again, I will remove you from this room myself. The detective opted to shut her mouth for once. Her lack of rebellion prompted Victoria to cock an eyebrow, scribble something on a piece of paper, and then to pocket it for later. It was the late Thanatos' death which alerted us to the situation. A disturbance and calamity that could not be ignored, she continued. I called the aeif to action at 0700 hours, and we departed the archive for the Isle Caligo, with those present half an hour after that. Thus, smiles the vampire, the battle began. A 600-strong Nyxian army cascaded through silver portals, one by one, arriving unannounced on Bloodsucker soil. Tartarus Abdul and Metis Saskia led groups of 200 on the left and right flanks respectively, with Thanatos Mercy and Pallas Victoria leading the stride together. Aoife Sheridan followed in their wake, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and Old Man Kresnik, whom she figured was an easy target. Isle Caligo was slapdashed in a coat of blackness as far as the eye could not see. Aoife was able to bless herself with night vision with one of the few spells she'd picked up in her time amongst the witches, revealing a kind of angular dystopia. At her feet were just rocks, cobbled together as if with glue by some menace of a child assigned art homework. It had no grass, nor were there any trees. If there had been livestock, it would not have been for very long. Aoife's night eyes had revealed their location. The Intrinsic Council's portals had placed them all on the eastern coast of the island, far enough inland from the ever-stretched sea to host the similarly vast waves of soldiers. It didn't clear much of the middle distance, that said. Caligo was entrenched in a mist thick enough to respond to movement, which smelled of dehydrated gravy granules. A few miles out, if Aoife squinted enough, she could see shacks built out of the same round stones behind the shifting fog. No shadows visible, nor figures in the distance. It wasn't as though she was expecting any kind of welcome wagon, but she figured there'd at least be some evidence of the Dracula's occupation, unless their numbers had thinned significantly, or, considering the reason for this less than diplomatic visit, a crucifixion, or a head or two on a pike. Being a pacifist at heart, War Witch Victoria intended on summoning the sovereign of the Isle for a peaceful, non-negotiable arrest to avoid any further bloodshed, red, blue, or otherwise. Empowered, however, by the late king's world-bending wish, the fang-toothed prisoners struck with surprise in their pockets. It was the mist. No, rather, they were the mist. This was their own fault. Not one of the intrinsic witches knew of this latent ability, nor did the so-called vampire hunter, for it was information lost well to the fallen ages. Vampires were shapeshifters only when well-fed, a state which they had long since been forced to abandon. It was only by Fortune's hand that Aoife Sheridan had been stood close by the palace, who, at the mere inkling of danger, was able to summon a whirring sphere of hot air to blast back the beasts. Many of her soldiers were not so lucky. From minute one of the fight, there were 50 casualties amongst the Nixian army, felled by myriad claws bestrewing sinew. It should have been clear from the get-go. Surrender was not an option. After all, in this case, the witches were little more than an invading force in a fourth world country. To quote the king's own for once valid words, "Nobody comes to high tea with 600 trained killers." Indignant silence shrouded Caligo as the Nixian forces adjusted themselves from backed down backup to the front line of an all-out war, just long enough for Aoife Sheridan to see not a single drop of witch blood going to waste. The vampires fed as swift as they were able, stuffing entrails and protoplasm down their gullets before half of their battalion drew themselves into mist once more, moving into the second phase of their attack. Not a single weapon amongst either side. Natural-born practitioners of their own vicious art forms face each other in a new, blind panic. It didn't help that Victoria's footmen had been instructed to bind the vampires with Ocnus rope, a non-lethal technique crafted by the palace herself as a new approach to combat situations. But its merciful nature proved ineffective against such an unquenched thirst for vengeance. "Spread out!" boomed the amplified voice of the War Witch, whose words were a kind of magic in their own right, able to rally the troops into fighting fit form. As she rose into the sky, a thin, fluttering, golden glow surrounded those who fought under her command, healing their minor wounds and inspiring inextinguishable confidence. It allowed, without having to state their intentions, the IAEF to simultaneously switch to a more violent approach. They were not to kill, just to maim, for now. Now, Aoife had to dodge not only the swiping of the fiends, but also the careering balls of flame and the beams of hard light, which fired out from every direction, tearing limbs from their sockets and punching large, perfect circles in chests. She had few options available to her, combat-wise. Sure, she could clock a dude in the side of the head if she needed to, but it was wall-to-wall warfare out there, and her brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would have little effect so far out of her depth. She wasn't out here to fight, though she knew that it was more than likely going to happen before the end of the day. It was her job to seek the corpse of Thanatos Llewellyn, or, at the very least, significant evidence of its disintegration. Fact is, espionage works better if you slip behind enemy lines before they start to attack you. A fit-bodied Dracula with hollow cat-slip pupils and red smears where his lips once were had already clocked her for a weakling. Aoife thought it strange. They didn't all look like snarling monsters. It was as though this one had partially transformed into a more feral state. His bare feet had become flat and triple-pronged with one bird-like perching toe. His two most prominent fangs had grown to almost tusk length, and he squealed near constantly as he was now unable to close his mouth around them. His ears were now tipped with a pointed V shape. Considering her lack of offensive magic, Aoife had but one choice. She would have to summon to her side a denizen of the plate below her own, a remnant, of which there were a great many swarming in the stretched, mirror-image desert that was the universe's trash heap. She had open contact with only a few, and less than that liked her company enough to risk reincarnation for her. Tied to the ash-bearer tattoo on the inside of her left wrist was a magic circle in the shape of a decorated pentagram, which could be used to temporarily call the minor spirit, known as Decarabia, to attention. As a former mortal, Aoife's magical prowess was limited, to say the least. She was not powerful enough to conjure a solid form for Decarabia, no matter how temporary. Instead, she'd have to make do with what she had around her. A severed head lay nearby, which once belonged to another vampire. So much for non-lethal, huh?
Cold,
said the creature, gasping for the air for which they so desperately yearned. It was common knowledge that the remnants, as a species, coveted existence on the mortal plane, for only here were they empowered to the extent of demigods. It was a good rule of thumb to remember that no matter the hump they might put on, there was very little they would not do to touch even the soil.
And this is your offering?
There is no offering, she replied in the tone of a strict mother, shunting the head towards the opposing vampire, and then around the battlefield in a circle. Assist me or die here, monster.
We cannot die,
hissed Decarabia.
and we bow to no threats.
I promise you, Aoife told them as the enemy made to lunge at her. I can show you a life pretty damn close to death. As she sidestepped the onslaught, Aoife was certain that she heard Decarabia tut at her. In return for this incredulity, Aoife swung the loose head, smacking her assailant in the temple with it. A grim prospect, given how the vampires all knew each other quite well, but needs must in this sort of situation, she supposed. With a cry, he fell backwards in stunned shock, just as the makeshift weapon began to crystallize in Aoife's cold, tattooed hands, a sign that Decarabia had ceased its infernal whinging and had agreed to cooperate with her wishes. Soon, the entire head was encompassed, swallowed whole by clumps of a semi-transparent cyan material, with a texture not unlike the inside of a geode, which Aoife could shatter with ease between her fingers. As the glistening shards fell halfway to her feet, they dissipated and became a kind of pale blue vapor, which rose up and whirlwinded around the tips of her fingers, absorbing into her skin. Similar crystals began to sprout from her nail beds and spread down the bones, birthing out the back of her hand, signifying their unholy collaboration. With this ritual complete in its entirety, Aoife had bestowed upon herself the blessing of Decarabia, time-limited free access to a slither of the remnant's unusual abilities without the need for eternal bonding. As a downside, it did suppress Naberius for the hour, but she had no need of their innate gift in such a dangerous situation. She had summoned Decarabia just once before, and so she knew the basic ins and outs of this power. It allowed her to alter the composition of the very air around her, transforming what appears to be nothing into brilliant gemstones, eventually expending the available oxygen supply. Aoife herself couldn't suffocate, but she couldn't use it in an enclosed space of any kind, nor would it work in a vacuum. The vampire squealed again and began to charge towards her with its head down like a goddamn bull. She reached out towards her foe with metered patience, counting the long strides between them as he drew closer. At her command, she could feel the molecules shifting into place, bunching together as she stretched out her fingers. As she grasped at the inexhaustible space immediately ahead, a straight line of crystals the size of clenched fists burst forth, clocking the vampire in the mouth and piercing a gape through the back of his throat. It held him, hung static in space, for a moment before the attack was able to dissolve into the sky as diamond dust. Her foe slumped without sound, not dead, not yet. It would heal this damage after a feed or two, but he was so far out for the count, leaving only upwards of 300 Draculas left to avoid. Aoife swung herself around 360 degrees in search of her boon. Impossible, obviously. Not even with night eyes could she see through the mountains of mangled warriors and those who still stood brawling atop them. It was, all in all, an even scrap, despite the vampires having a home field advantage. Untargeted for the moment, Aoife crouched and summoned beneath her feet a tower of the blue crystals to send her high above the drama for a better view of it all. She could see Mercy to the east raising the fallen to fight on her behalf. Both witch and vampire alike swallowed her enemies with sheer mass over matter, like how honeybees might swarm on a lone assailing wasp. To the north, Fort Victoria, hovering at a similar level to the detective, maneuvering her forces to victory. Aoife figured the corpse of the former Thanatos would be located amongst the stone shacks she'd seen earlier, but she couldn't focus well enough on how to get there, because there were 5 more fucking Draculas clawing at the crystal length beneath her. Planting both palms on the tower, Aoife unleashed a rough growl of exertion and concentrated all her strength into her arms. She channeled a well of energy into it, demanding that it change shape at her whim. What the crystal lost in length it gained in icicle sharpness, as a pentacle of piercing rods extended from the core and skewered her foes as before. It wasn't enough to take them down though, just enough to stun them, to shed a little royal blue. Soon enough, they were tugging themselves free, a wound small enough for their bodies to heal without trouble. Crafty bastards even started using these new crystal spines to climb towards her, lever themselves, and leap. "Ah, forget this," said the detective, quick to flap. Aoife threw herself from the pedestal, landing hard on the rocks below. She'd intended to roll, but there was no purchase in the cobble for that sort of extravagance. A clap, and she commanded the tower to fall, but the slippery bastards just kept on coming. It was time to employ the age-old technique of running the fuck away, leaving behind herself wall after wall of thick crystal as a deterrent. Indeed, the vampires gave chase. Not one of 5 were dumb enough to just bump into the front door-sized blocks of sapphire. Evidently, what they gained in horror from their bestial transformation, they did not lose in problem-solving or comprehension. She kept on stumbling and fumbling over the misshapen earth with each mistake, allowing the enemies to catch up, one footprint at a time. There was little chance of her taking them all on at once. There was a limit on how much damage she could just shrug off. And she figured once they got a taste of the ink in her veins, they wouldn't exactly want seconds. It didn't matter how close she got to the residential area of the Isle Caligo. Her pursuers weren't going to give up chase just because she'd passed some invisible line. Aoife had to do something about this, but she'd exhausted all of her offensive capabilities and had nothing... Oh, duh, Aoife thought to herself as she clocked the hovering visage of one Pallas Victoria, drawing ever closer to her as she ran without aim or reason. If she wanted to congratulate herself, she might have said that this was her plan all along, but in reality, it was just difficult to keep track of her direction in the phosphor-green glow that was her night vision. With a dash, Aoife steered herself towards the palace, taunting the vampires with a middle finger as she went, leading them to a very certain end, as long as the next few seconds fell into her favor. As if she were firing a pistol, Aoife aimed that same finger towards the War Witch, Victoria's head in her sights, 5 vampires closing in on her position. Accompanied by a slight bang reminiscent of a pop gun, Aoife fired a pebble-sized crystal smack dab into Victoria's cheek. Her bullet plinked off the target, disappearing before it could touch down. Pallas Victoria whipped her neck around to witness the now stationary Aoife Sheridan, waving and pointing at her predators like an excited gibbon, half surprised that the witch had even felt what amounted to a fly bumping into a Tyrannosaurus. Victoria spent no time lambasting the detective, for once, and pointed her open palm to the heavens above, before clenching it into a fist. From betwixt the clouds were cast grand golden ropes, which shone with the ferocity of the sun as they jailed the vampires in question. From their screaming, it could only be assumed that the bindings burned on contact with that same ferocity. Not finished, the intrinsic witch made a similar motion once again. Thus followed another celestial Ocnus rope, summoned by the hands which first crafted the spell, only this time heading straight for Aoife herself. It did not hurt her, though it was not gentle as it snaked its way around her waist and tightened at command. "Don't you fucking Aoife's cuss was cut off by a squawk that she could not control. A noise that, until now, she did not know that she could make, erupted from her core as she was flung through the air without any care for damage by Pallas Victoria. It was with some force too. 30 stories up, 40, 45 before she came to her descent. No matter what kind of creature fell this distance, they would have little left to call innards. Aoife swiped in the open nothingness, summoning a cyan platform for herself to stand upon, but it sank all the same as she did, because she knew no magic that might levitate it. No time to panic. She dashed herself across the block, crafting as she leapt another, and another, and another, making the final leg of her journey amongst the clouds. "Look out below!" she called to nobody in particular, her words forced back into her mouth by the gale force around her. She'd been tossed far enough out of the battle to avoid crushing any unsuspecting combatants anyway. Hell, she was walking across the platforms by the end of her trip, a real walking away from an explosion move. Aoife Sheridan, lame as can be. At 8 feet from the ground, Aoife hopped off her sudden mode of transport and sought to catch the breath that she did not normally need. Decorabia's crystals had all but vanished from her fingers, near exhausted, even though there was plenty of time left on the clock. It was tough to eyeball, but ballpark, Aoife figured she had but one blast left in her, were it to come down to a fight. To the best of her intuition, this part of the Isle Caligo was deserted now. Earlier, Aoife figured those vampires who'd vanished from the fray would have retreated here to lay quiet as the second wave reinforcements, but there was no hanging fog, and no movement in the cold blanket of shadows. She'd found herself standing at the teeth of a gawking village, each dwelling an impoverished mola, standing perhaps only a foot taller than the average resident, with no door to hide only a mess of bedrolls. All of them were like this. Ramshackle placement, innumerable in total. No possessions, no loose clothing, not a single book amongst them. Great Salem, it was like they'd been put into stasis, into purgatory, just waiting for nothing. Christ, even murderers get books and food and shelter. In this break in the combat, it was difficult not to feel like she was fighting on the wrong side. A foreboding wave washed away any inkling of duty for, despite the altogether lack of living space, all evidence suggested that there were plenty of vampires that were not accounted for anywhere anymore. Llewellyn's body was in the furthermost lodge, at such peace that it appeared he was simply sleeping off a long day. Intrinsic witches decay as they live, over an inestimable period of time. His skin was plump, if pale, and there was a wee smile on his face, just a cat curl at the corner of his lips. In the air, there was the faint smell of spring flowers. It was impossible to tell how long he had been dead, and Aoife could still detect some vague sense of Decorabia's presence in the back of her head, so reviewing the events which led up to the Thanatos' death was well out of the question ad interim. What was the plan now then? Aoife couldn't get back to Nomi Scrimasi without one of the witches, and she wasn't exactly safe here. Whoa, was she running on empty? A rush of faint-headedness came over her, a sensation that, for her kind, was rare and not without its worries. She needed a sit-down and a cigarette. Beside the floral corpse, Aoife Sheridan stretched out her legs and focused on building back up her steam, listening to the sounds of war in the distance. It had raged for a constant hour now, and as Aoife unwillingly rested her eyes, many more passed without incident. She, the reigning visage of the inevitable end, ironically or not so known as Thanatos' mercy, could see the flesh of no mortal being. All were but bones to her, since her undue coronation. Though they could move by the will of their meat, pistoned by whole hearts, though they bled and fought, spoke and struggled, it mattered not to death. Before she was chosen against Nyx's better judgment 47 years ago, Mercy Van Dyke was a practitioner of modern and magical medicines, serving the population of Nomi Scrimasi Island against the throes of doom, being only a savant dabbler in the machinations of necromancy out of sheer interest. Why she was picked above all else Mercy did not know, for Nyx was not one to cues. With skeletons surrounding her on every side, where friend and foe clashed fist and face, Mercy acted as the magic decreed and did her duty as it was. She and her council mates were but filled vessels. Of course, they had much control over their truest actions, but in the drama of war and all, it always felt to Mercy that Nyx would take the helm. That said, little study had been done on their living phenomena. for the intrinsic council were touched rarely, if ever, so the truth was obscured an impossibility. As Thanatos, Mercy noticed not when those around her ceased to breathe. It was, in fact, the case that the more death that surrounded her, the more bolstered her federation would become. Mercy commanded the amassing dead from their unexpectedly brief respite in a form which rendered any earlier actions null and void. Vampire or witch, she physically could not care. They all got up at her beck and call by whatever hands and feet they had left over. Extending from each of her white-painted fingernails was the physical manifestation of her title. Mercy, able to discern the expired from the soon-to-be only by the presence of strings the color of mallow flower, invisible to all but herself, which ran from the spinal columns of the risen and stranded them to her as a moaning menagerie of macabre marionettes. She could, at will, command them to strike at her foes who, to her disgusted eyes, were oddly shaped in comparison to her cohorts, their fingers being clawed not with keratin, but with bone, which extended from their contorted skeletons as corkscrew points. As she puppeted those who were once people, some only of a kind, Mercy felt a strange tugging at her battle dress coming from behind her, something small, something weak, hobbled at the knee, no taller than a child and far less innocent, a frail and battered collection of bones and bumping organs and sinew and tumors, one whose ribs had been broken and splintered and reset so many times they now more resembled the aching teeth of a dropped grand piano. It was the man of Kresnik blood. His major malfunction was a missing forearm, though it would not be the end of him. "I beg of you," he said, with the clashing of canines as percussion to his plea. In his free and remaining hand were the bones of the other. He was tapping the severed borders together as if blood were an adhesive. Mercy was too young to have known any previous member of his clan, though she had done a little reading of the case in her 168 years, and considered him and his predecessors as little more than pretenders to the title of hunter. It was, indeed, the witches who had done most, if not all, of the heavy lifting in that long since past crisis, not that it was to their credit. "Please, you must help me, witch. I am on your side in this fight, am I not?" It was her opinion that the Kresniks knew only how to lop from the neck the heads of the Hydra. Oh, Mercy flinched as this train of thought there sparked the engine of another. They would, if things were not to look up, have to burn the stumps to prevent regrowth. It told her what needed to be done, the magic, that is. Herself attempted to argue, somewhere long back there in the deepest recesses of her head. She struggled to concentrate on it. She did not want to see the saint-borne vampires eradicated. It was not part of the plan. No, that was not it, for they were brought into this world for a reason that was unknown to her. They were not some kind of fairy tale Nosferatu. They were not the result of some vile illness. They were a community once, cursed with immortality by the ancient and long-dead Saint Aoife. For how long would the magic allow her to feel this way? Death, she knew, was an absolute. It would come to all, even those who claim immortality, even to those who claim eternality. But to eradicate a population for the actions of a monarch was a kind of coward's shortcut. Not in that way of thinking that to desert the cause of the crisis on an island with nothing to eat but each other was in any way brave. Yes, infinite isolation was undoubtedly unjust. Life sentences pertain to a crime proper, of course, and the witches were not so modern that they discarded the penalty of death. But perpetuity was its own sort of punishment. Mercy knew that all too well, for she had, when the magic permitted her time to do so, wished for it to end all the same as it did for everybody else. She could not help but presume that the expulsion of the vampires was a decision made rash in the warmth of rage. Were it not, there would be none left to wage war against, would there? And then the magic ebbed back into place, as if Nyx himself wrapped around her like a cloak of some kind, told her exactly what needed to happen, and that it was only her that could perform the sequential deeds necessary to cease this mortal combat before it came to something it was not. In contemplation, the face of death looked to the sky and then to the middle distance, but never once back at the bleeding Kresnik. It would not be long then till the magic forced her to action. The Sleepy Bones Detective Agency presents Should We Just Kill All the Vampires? Episode 2. Could we? It was impossible to tell how long she had slept. Aoife would later discover it had been more than 10 hours. Still, the fighting had not ceased. Nor had it slowed. Why would it? They were waiting for two things: the body and the heart. Enough time had passed that Decarabia was no longer fused to her, having returned to the world's filter where it belonged. Naberius had woken and was stirring with the boredom of seclusion as an intrusive thought might. It, like herself, desired answers. And answers it would have soon enough. Aoife took her left index finger to her lips and pierced the calloused skin of the tip with her canine. Beneath this thickened layer, she'd hidden a medical-grade scalpel blade, which had been stored for occasions which required a subtle donation. Due to her body being in a near-constant stasis point between inertia and healing, it caused her no discomfort during day-to-day activities, as long as she didn't bump it or jam it against anything. Its point sprouted forth from its fleshy prison, bringing up no blood, or rather, ink, with it. Aoife dug the tapered edge into the softest part of the Thanatus's inner elbow, nicking a dead vein clean in half. He bled like anything else ultimately confirmed to be mortal in the end. A slow trickle. She'd have to wring his body dry to get any real answers. To this new wound, she took to her knees and placed her lips, putting any vampiric connotations out of her mind. Aoife wrapped her hands around either side of the slit and squeezed, forcing a mouthful of metallic, lukewarm ooze down her throat. Faster than morphine bliss, the detective was overcome with visions and flavors of Llewellyn's long and storied life, which blasted through her mind like a mortar barrage. It was a powerful gift, that which Naberius offered to her, but it was not without its hiccups. Information came at random. She tasted the first bite of a hog leg at a grand seated feast. She felt the shame of a poor hand in the penultimate throes of a high-stakes poker game, in which the witch lost all but a few bob. And she saw his coronation as the Thanatus of the Fourth Intrinsic Council, which came 24 years before her own birth and was mostly fuzzed and in black and white. Nothing of use, nothing of substance. Again, Aoife went in for another gulp, but before she was able to get her teeth stuck in, she was struck from behind. It was as though she'd chanced upon a bear trap. Barbed talons ignored her flesh and sought out the bone beneath the meat. before she could coil herself like a snake to turn and face her attacker. The detective was tossed outwards through the stone wall, causing the simple shack to collapse around the corpse and them both. She was conscious, but dizzy, halfway through the door of a concussion. This new enemy, who now stood amongst a few unsteady columns of rock, shook and wobbled with her vision. As the distorted visage came to a halt, unblurred and reformed, Aoife saw that it was wearing a crown of blue bones. The king of vampires held the deceased Thanatos by the collar of his shirt and said nothing as he made off to the left at a leisurely pace. Aoife looked down at her leg. It oozed the black that had long replaced her own blood. It gave her a strange feeling, not in her chest but in her pocket. When a human saw their own blood, providing they weren't among the 15% that passed out at the sight of it, they were often overcome with panic. Blood is equal to life. Losing blood meant losing life, and to lose life meant death. Simple. Obviously, this was not the case for Aoife Strangelove Sheridan. Losing quote-unquote blood was much akin to losing money. Ash-bearer ink was a valuable and limited resource, as it was derived from the corpse of Sinise Nix. To the witches, Aoife was a dragon, tantamount to Smaug, sitting atop a pile of gold, or something along those lines. It was not too deep a wound that she would not heal in a matter of minutes, but she could not stand on it. Already it had begun to bubble and pinch together. If she was to wait though, then the king of vampires would make a complete exit. He was skulking into the distance, further and further away from the battlefield, aiming for the unobstructed ocean from which the Thanatos could never be recovered. A choice had to be made, and on reflection in the meeting, Aoife realized that it took her very little persuasion to do the thing that she did, as though the instructions were written on the inside of her eyelids in permanent marker. Aoife reached down, grasping the ankle of her injured limb. She twisted, hocked, and wrenched the wounded 3/4 from its gash. As if it were a paintbrush, Aoife surrounded herself in the only summoning sigil that she knew from memory, the Nixian Declaration of War. Without so much as a beat, the detective was encapsulated by and promptly ejected backwards from a pillar of golden light. Revealed by the subsiding glow, standing, or rather floating like a cursed chandelier, was the pissed-off Pallas Victoria herself. Use of the summoning circles was forbidden, of course, because it required both a frankly outlandish amount of Ash-bearer ink and a user who was willing to sacrifice something. Although at the time, Aoife was unsure if it was her leg that she'd sacrificed, or her pride. Victoria looked stunned for a second, unsure of exactly what had occurred. Summoning circles were secondarily banned due to the fact that they, without a shadow of a doubt, worked every single time. Even on the intrinsic council. Sacrifice, whatever that truly meant, trumps any duty that might require a demigod's full attention. The palace looked around for whatever had the gall to summon her from her commanding post, only to see the wincing detective waving her own amputated leg right back at her. "Bloody Salem," she said in disgust, sticking her pink tongue all the way out of her mouth. "Stem the flow, Strangelove. You're leaking valuable ink." "Yeah, I'm alright. Thanks for asking," she shouted back weakly. "Would you mind picking up my slack back there?" "What's new?" shrugged the bitch witch supreme as she loosed, with no effort at all, an Ocnus rope from the palm of her hand. It sought the departing king of vampires like an anti-heat-seeking missile, though she'd aimed not for the Night Stalker himself, but his deceased captive. After all, he could just as easily turn into mist or a bat, were those legends true. He did just that. The mist, not the bat. At the slightest hint of danger, as if, after all that, Llewellyn was entirely worthless to him. Victoria reeled in the corpse like a waterlogged boot, dragging his temporarily incorruptible form across rocks and cobble, bumping and bashing him on the way. Just as he was within her reach, the mist reintegrated into the crown shape which socked Victoria under the chin with an uppercut that rivaled the work of Jersey Joe Walcott. Immortal? Yes. Invulnerable? No. Especially susceptible, it seemed, to the element of surprise. Victoria, so often so slow to rise to any occasion which required real rage, struck back with a Canorca thrown, which broke both the left-hand side bones of the crown and the king's zygomatic orbital. Pieces of cyan skeleton crumbled to the ground with the clink of ceramic on stonework, or like a handful of pennies scattered on a frozen lake. The two unkillables traded blows for long enough that Aoife's body had stemmed the flow, as Victoria requested, sealing off the thumpless veins. She felt okay for somebody in a tremendous amount of non-threatening but still rather agonizing pain. Her nerve endings were coming back to life. Her literally perfect body was reminding itself what was supposed to go where before it started acting on the situation, like a phantom limb. Aoife could feel her missing leg, as though it were already there, though who knew how long it might take for it to actually grow back. She could bend the knee, wriggle her toes, even feel the weight of it fairly accurately. Or at least, as accurately as she could imagine, she supposed. Not that she could imagine it for very long. Not with all this yelling. Victoria was ordering the King of Vampires to surrender the heart, wherever it might be, to give way to the witches, and to call off the men and women who were fighting for, well, what honestly seemed to be no reason at all. Revenge was par for the course, due, and above all best served on your own home turf against an armed and orderly force. But was it, even having been regenerated to their full strength, enough? What were their chances, anyway? Aoife put it at ballpark 7% at best. Maybe less, even. Sure, they'd kill a few witches more. Hell, they could swear off the entire IAEF. But they'd still have to deal with the council and their mama bear, who could, but wouldn't, simply erase the saintly progenitor of this particular vampire mutation from the annals of time and be done with the whole situation with but a thought over a cup of chai and time. That's when it hit her. It didn't matter if they won. This was sacrificial warfare. Vampires as salmon, a steady stream of fall guys. The king of vampires was waiting out the clock, as though no matter who died or what happened between the 3-day swing of Nyx's pendulum, they would have earned their second wish. According to Aoife's historically awful timekeeping, the heart of Sinise Nyx would sleep for approximately a day and a half more. It was imperative that they found it as soon as possible, but what then? The King of Vampires let loose a screech so loud that Aoife could see the shockwaves vibrating through the dark air itself. At this beckoning call came a mist thick and of a meaty waft. It drew in from the battlefield, coming from behind her, parting like a waterfall passing the nose of a boulder as it ignored the bloodless detective. A viscous conglomerate of cognitive vapor bound Pallas Victoria by the arms and by the legs. It held her in that semi-opaque form, using the compounded strength of the 8 or 9 from whom it was composed. Enfeebled, the war witch cried for mercy. Mercy, considered the king of vampires, whose usual unrestrained expression had turned off, thick and sour. You shall find none here, as was the case for us and ours. He took leisurely to the corpse of Thanatos Llewellyn, and, in a gesture that took as much force as one might need to knock down a reinforced steel door, punctured the demigod's belly flesh. Hidden in his core was a mass of black stone, an organ charred by the flames of birth. As the king inspected it, he muttered to himself, "Still asleep, are you? No matter." And like a snake with an egg, the vampire unhinged his goddamn jaw before all who watched with sickened, slacked gulps. He swallowed the bloodied heart of Sinise Nix, albeit with some difficulty. "That is fucking dirty," shouted Aoife in an attempt to lighten the load of the loss. It was now Dracula's 2, witches 0. "Hush, hush, no blood," calmed the king, following a guttural grunt as the stone reached the seabed of his stomach. "There is little now to do but wait for victory." "You're gonna make us watch you shit that out, aren't you?" she said, sticking an ink-smeared finger down the back of her throat, mimicking a vomit. "What is your plan here, vampire?" asked Victoria, ignoring the ill-advised and vile comment, struggling still against her semi-visible captors. "If we fail here, the Kronos will not. She will see to it that your wish is not granted, no matter what happens." The king of vampires shrugged his shoulders at her. "Your time witch can do nothing against the strength of her own god. Is that not true? I am no atheist. We ourselves were instated by a god of some kind, even if you accept him only as a saint. I know well enough that all acts of Nyx are fixed points in time, else our former liege's wish would have been undone at the very beginning, and our plan foiled. Beg me not when it comes, vampire. This war of yours has a due time limit," she continued, undeterred. "If we are not successful before the heart is set to wake, the Kronos will act without charge." Victoria said all of this with a smile on her face, though it was not a particularly convincing one. "We will remain in this loop of events till you fall in battle or surrender. Who knows how long we've been at this, or how many times I have made this speech to your wadded ears." The king of vampires considered her words for a moment, just long enough for Aoife's femur to start materializing, but he shrugged all the same. "I have it on good authority that your master, so to speak, has limited authority to act. She will not risk her own life to break the unwritten rules of reality. After all, the consequences of her own disappearance are grand in scale, compared to a matter as cosmically insignificant as this, I believe, and you are free to disagree, until proven otherwise, that as we are standing here in this position, still, at this time where I have possession of your most precious artifact, that the Time Witch has seen these events play out and has decided that this is how it is to be. Perhaps," he continued, "she sides with us after all." "Fuck," said Aoife Sheridan, almost to herself it was that quiet. "He's bloody got you there, Vicky." She was stalling, strange love, came the cold, monotonous voice of death. Thanatos Mercy stood as tall as ever in her undamaged battle dress. Her hood was up over her twin-bunned hair, and her sleeves were rolled up to the elbow. Her faint mauve emanation waved in the aisle's wind, as if it were cigarette smoke fanning from her exposed skin. Trailing behind her, crouched and ignored and snivelling into his own detached limb, was the elderly Kresnik fella, with his doe eyes and limited conception of his own unascertained fate. Commanding both the attention of the present parties, as well as all the available grace and elegance on the isle, Thanatos Mercy flitted her hands in front of her in a kind of figure-8 motion. Glitters of that purple energy followed each finger like the ribbons of great comets, lasting only as long as the act itself. She then pointed her left index finger at the corpse of her predecessor, fourfold removed, and it began to lift into the air, hips and shoulders first. Mercy spoke, her firm voice resonating with the infinite strength which carved the figures of the intrinsic council into the universe's alabaster walls. With but one thought, I will revive this man to his original form, wound and all, and he will at my command unveil the sun as one might draw back the curtains on a summer morning. You jest, said the king, though this time he did not shrug his shoulders. He stood, frozen in a half-step back away from her, just watching as the dead man began to rotate into a vertical position. I have never been known to jest, said Mercy. And, despite his current circumstances, it is only this man who stands between yourself and the all-encompassing vanishment of your myth. Surrender yourself, or submit your folk to the immediacy of mortal forgottens. It was silent then, and it remained so until Mercy snapped her fingers and a rush of air filled the dead lungs of Thanatos Llewellyn. Before his eyes could open, however, the king of vampires raised his arms in defeat and screeched again. I surrender, were his next words in the common tongue. I have called off my folk. True to his word, the meld of man-eaters pinning Pallas Victoria's extremities split, reforming as 2 men and 6 women, none of whom bore the patented pointed ears or snarling faces of their war forms. My liege, spoke one of the women, you cannot be serious. This is an outrage. After all we have done to get here, you surrender? Do not speak of me as a coward, said the king, calm as the night around him, as Victoria approached to cuff him with another Ocnus rope. To be forgotten at this point would be no victory. Perhaps, through negotiation, we can settle this once and for all, child. With the flick of a wrist, Victoria summoned a kind of flare signal, which shot up into the sky and burst like a bright green firework. In the distance, silver dishes of light could be seen opening up portals back to Nomi Grimarsi Island. In the ensuing moments, all who could still stand disembarked the Isle Caligo, to be replaced by medical officers, and soldiers spared the first wave to treat well the wounded and keep watch of the remaining verbally disarmed combatants. Thanatos Mercy approached he who once held that title, half resurrected, standing on locked knees but not yet actually breathing of his own accord. Placing her hand over his eyes, she commanded him back to his rest, at which point he fell backwards into her arms. She held him close, as though he weighed nothing at all, before absconding through her own portal, intent on preparing him for a traditional burial on his home soil. Aoife Sheridan, still wounded but no longer in so much pain, followed after over the shoulder of Eduardo Kresnik, who had hardly yet realized that the long battle was finally over. It was Thanatos Mercy's point of view which concluded the overall settlement of events, and thus the tally of casualties were declared in her pallid timbre. 262 in total, 165 witch, 97 vampire. Jeez, that sure is a lot of bodies considering how much the word immortal is thrown about in here, said Aoife, much to herself as she awaited her leg to begin the final stages of reconstruction. As far as her nasty little comments usually went, this one received no credence or comments from anybody, for it rang a little too close to home. It was met with silence until Métis Saskia took to the metaphorical stand. From nowhere, she apparated an inflexible sheet of black paper, off of which she could read the total charges held against the king of vampires. As a council, we here shall now pass judgment on your guilt. Do you understand? Norm nodded. You are hereby accused of the murder of a former member of the Intrinsic Council, attempted escape from the prison known as the Isle Caligo, as well as the consequences thereof vis-a-vis the aforementioned casualties. Norm's ever-present grin dripped not to an angry expression, but a more neutral one overall. What? Was all he said, just like that, exposing the regal fallacy he'd attempted to court prior to this. Yeah, added Aoife. What? We, as a council, continued Saskia, after a hearty sigh, are to come to accords on the punishment relating to those crimes I have spoken. Murder, attempted escape from prison, and starting a war and almost winning it, added Aoife, her head still cocked to the side in confusion. In essence, said Saskia, looking closely at the rap sheet, that is what I mean, yes. It seems quite unnecessary to list any other counts, don't you think? For, I believe, the penalty is death. I have a question, said Tartarus Abdul, crunching his knuckles. Before we continue with this deposition, if I may. He did not wait for confirmation. Nobody would dare interrupt this hulk of a man. Had you delayed us long enough, what exactly did you intend to do with the heart of Sinis Nix? A simple question, began the king. To leave for inhabited land. I intended on scattering across whichever hemisphere would have been shrouded in darkness, appropriate, of course, to the time of our victory. Bullshite, cried Aoife. If that were true, you wouldn't have been prepared for a whole goddamn war. You could have just done that from the get-go, and we could have done nothing about it. If you are referring to the first wish we made, that was the choice of the remorseful. That said, he continued, I agreed with it wholeheartedly. It was not an attempt to gain an upper hand, for he did not expect a battle. It was simply that, without that first wish, were we to emigrate elsewhere, we would all be overcome with the desire to feed within moments. We are not savages by instinct. It was a fresh start, a clean slate. That is what the remorseful asked for from your god, if that makes more sense to you. Huh. I still don't believe you, said the detective. She'd figured that if he were speaking true to heart, they could have just made those wishes in the opposite order. But she chose not to pursue it any further at the time. She could, before the sentence was passed, taste his blood and seek his truest memories to discover where his intentions lay. If we are through with this chatter, said Métis Saskia, sharpening her cleaver to cut straight to the bone of the meeting, I suggest that we execute the King of Vampires publicly, and, in the same breath, we decrease the size of the Isle Caligo. I do not believe I need to justify this decision, don't you agree? Don't be a fool, Saskia, argued Victoria. We are in this situation because our forebears put the vampires on that island and forgot about them. To make it smaller would ignore the reason for these so-called crimes. We should consider how unjust the previous judgments truly were before we attempt to erase the saint-borne vampires from existence again. Tartarus Abdul attempted to cut in. Have you forgotten, but was halted by Métis Saskia, who stood to deliver a verdict updated in the few moments between turns? You are correct, Victoria. We should consider the previous judgment. Those animals have clearly learned nothing from their captivity. It led only to further harm of our kind, and will result in nothing but mortal bloodshed. You do not see this, I understand, she said. But you do make a point. Perhaps we should simply erase them from existence. Perhaps we should execute every vampire. You are out of your goddamn mind, shouted Aoife, so alerted that she too stood to her feet, although she was lopsided as the actual foot had not grown back yet. Learn a little history, dickhead. You can't just eradicate an entire population because they do something you don't like. Are you fucking dense? They prey on the living, on humans, do they not? Said Saskia, unperturbed by Aoife's sudden raised voice. If we were to release them into the wild as you so wish, then the resulting deaths would be on your conscience. So do bears, yelled Aoife. Are you gonna kill all the bears next? Mosquitoes kill 1 million people a year. I don't see you getting off your ass to squash every single mozzie. I'm not saying I would rather those mortal deaths weighing on my mind, but humans only think they're at the top of the food chain. A little competition won't shake up the world too hard. Plus, she said, a little calmer, I mean, for Salem's sake, you're talking about a genocide. Tartarus Abdul raised his hand once she finished. I think the Métis makes a sound point. Oh, you do ya? Countered Aoife. After I said the word genocide even. Not even a moment of hesitation, huh? I don't know what they teach you cunts in school, but you should be quaking in your goddamn boots at the mere hint of that word. As Eduardo Kresnik also raised his one remaining hand, Aoife mock spat on the ground. Don't you even fucking start, old man. In desperation, the detective turned to her rival, Pallas Victoria, and the so-quiet Thanatos Mercy, both of whom appeared to be deep in thought. You're not actually considering this, are you, Vicky? Victoria bit her lip. Absolutely not. We execute the king and we do it privately and on his terms. If we are to make a spectacle of this, we have failed as judges. Then, she continued, we release the vampires into the world under a number of conditions. They are not animals, Métis. They are people, and they can follow the word of law like any other person. Finally, some good fucking sense. You two, though, I cannot believe the words coming out of your mouth. You know exactly why this happened in the first place, and you want to double the fuck down? Aoife said, spittle escaping off her words like viscous onomatopoeia, like grey emphasis. She thumped around her pockets with such force that it looked as though she were trying to restart her still heart, hunting for a soft pack of cigarettes, and eventually finding one amongst a bushel of scrap paper. I need a break from this, she declared, stepping out from her chair with one foot and one thriving meaty stump. I'll be back in a second. Don't make a decision until I get back. Got it? She hobbled her way around the table like a knackered dog, stopping only beside the outstretched arm of Pallas Victoria, and even then only for a moment. Between her knuckles was a thin slip of folded paper, which Aoife took and pocketed in a gesture made as subtly as possible. At Victoria's whispered command so came true a simple door. with which the limping detective could abscond, leaving it cracked in her wake. This infant door, existing only for a moment, deposited Aoife Sheridan direct to a cobblestone courtyard, approximately 15 minutes at walking pace, and several stories down from where the meeting was taking place. It vanished on her side as soon as she took her eyes off it, leaving her only option to make the return journey on foot. The Nomi Grimarcy archive spanned much of the island from which it took its name. It was not a single building, as the name might suggest, but rather a fusion of 7 interconnected lots, all bigger on the inside due to magical meddling. It was a smorgasbord of stonework, brick and mortar galore. It appeared that Aoife was smack dab between the archive's grimoire library, less commonly referred to as the Aetherius Ascentorium, and the Our Lady of Palace School of Witchcraft. So there was a wealth of wandering witches smoking ciggies and pacing without aim, and generally avoiding each other's company, even as the stroke of midnight sounded by the striking of sunburnt silver bell song. It was muggy out tonight. Mist had drawn in thick like a swamped duvet, whilst the council were deliberating, and it was now so eerily damp that Aoife could not even strike a match in its thickness. Nomi Grimarcy was located in a protected and inaccessible section of the Southern Ocean, a few nautical miles outside the legal bounds of the Great Australian Bight, so the residents could enjoy a piss-boiling summer season and a not-so-goosebump-inducing autumn to winter. Granted, the actual weather conditions here were hand-engineered by a talented troupe of temperature thaumaturgists. Aoife snapped her fingers at one of the meandering magicians and asked for a light, which they provided at the tip of their thumb. A great gulp of smoke filled her lungs, and Aoife began to cool off a little. "Say," she began, trying to look the nervous witch in the eyes. They were doing that thing what people do when they've turned to face you but their eyes are making every effort to leave their sockets behind, in favour for the opposite direction. Play distracted, sort of. Aoife Sheridan had a bit of a tough reputation, but tough as a soup-hearty synonym for nasty. She continued, regardless. "Say, what did the weather call for tonight? Do you know?" "Oh!" The witch tutted, their attention thoroughly ensnared in a bit of gossip. "I know, right? Clear skies, my boot. I've been here going on 35 years now, and they've never once been wrong until tonight. I haven't missed a moon in a long, long time." "Yeah, that's what I thought." It should have been more obvious, really. It just didn't occur to her that they might have followed them home. It hit her not long after she spoke, recognizing that strange scent in the air, but before she could actually put it into words, the witchy near bystander and all others who could claim that demonym were torn in two down the middle. Aoife too was grappled from behind and, defenseless as she was silenced by an intruder. Norman Cra, king of saint-borne vampires, cast his sullen and dried eyes across the room. It was clear to him that the magnanimous masters of magic could not come to any solid concurrence other than the obvious, his own death, to which he was ambivalent at best, distracted by a shift in the air or perhaps something else. He empty-gazed towards the implausible freedom which lay just beyond the shoulders of his powerful captors. That door, though it belonged to the palace, had been left open to the innocent hallways like the idle lips of a mouth-breather, so lost in its tease, daydreaming for so long that even the so far silent Thanatos seemed to notice. If I might be so bold to speak before the declaration of my own immediate surrender to death, he began to pull himself back into the real world, addressing each of them with a glance. I have a few words to pass across the table, though I have prepared nothing special for any one of you. I have had long enough to come to terms with it, even before this meeting was called by what could be determined to be my initial actions. For an immortal bloodline, we, born of the Saint Aoife, discuss death as much of an inevitability as any mortal man may, if not more so. For though man dies, he is never so quickly forgotten. I pay this no attention. It is not my personage that will remain, is it? It is my shadow. I shall linger in the unparalleled rage of my kin. Know this, witch kind. Though you sentence me to my end, though you may choose to release my folk from a prison of hellish design, the Green One is correct. Our revolution will stop only when we are all dead, be it by your hand or our own. And no rule of law will stop them from what their nature desires most of all. Quick as a theatre blackout came the rolling in of bread-thick fog, forcing open the apparated door as if it held no weight at all. Miles and miles of enchanted stonework meaning absolutely nil to the incorporeal. It was only moments before the guards behind the King of Vampires were no longer connected to their heads by any means, that he was snatching for the still sleeping heart of Sinise Nix. The Sleepy Bones Detective Agency presents Should We Just Kill All the Vampires? Episode 3. Would we? Norman Craa, ever the silent plotter, was halted not by a shoot-from-the-hip spell, but by the strength of Tartarus Abdul's pickup truck fists. With the force of 2 intentional highway pile-ups, his knuckles careered through the table, splintering its center into innumerable, unrecognizable shards before colliding with the king's ribs. A shockwave forced the table's 2 segments to the far sides of the room, sending Norm way through the back wall where he fell hard amongst the Ascentorium's decorative quads. It was a vain attempt, however. Neither the strike nor the fall would kill a vampire on his level, and he had already firmly grasped the heart of Sinise Nix. In lighter circumstance, the horde of lower-rank vampires had already been dealt with by all parties present, bar Eduardo Kresnik, who had cowered in the corner, and Thanatos Mercy, who had somehow remained seated for the entire event. As if to add insult to mortal injury, Abdul tossed their bodies out of his new window to join their king, who, to the best of their knowledge, was likely to have already gotten himself back up. He didn't say a word to his fellow council members. Instead, the Tartarus took himself through Victoria's door and hurried to alert the Bell Watch, a sect of authorities who could, in turn, declare a state of emergency on the island. Métis Saskia vanished too, evaporated almost, with an audible pop, which did not entirely match the rather serious tone of the situation. Aoife Sheridan slid around the doorframe in great haste, almost falling flat on her face. Just the sight of her made Pallas Victoria cough out of sheer shock, for she was coated all over in a slick blue smear, most dense around her lips. Evidently it made finding purchase on that smoother stone a little more than difficult. "I come with news," she said. "But given the look of this place, you've already read the first edition, huh?" Victoria had no patience for the preamble, and she could tell just by the glint in Strangelove's eyes and, well, the mess of her, that she had already utilized the monster within her. "What have you seen?" "Oh, everything. I drank that whole guy." "Norm wasn't lying, see? They didn't want a war, not with you. He just left out a little information. Their first wish was to fill their stomachs, but they'd intended on using the second wish to rid themselves of their lethal solar allergy," she continued. "Then, he was gonna spread them across the world, take them wherever they wanted to go and live like kings amongst the cattle." Victoria considered this in silence, with her eyes doing plenty talking enough, scanning left to right as if she was speed reading a bad novel or watching a mentally taxing tennis match. It was clear that she, for once, had no idea how to act. Aoife had not often seen the palace stumped like this, and thought better of making some shitty comment. She could hear, coming from down below, the sound of the IAEF mobilizing against the shade-dwelling invaders. From her pocket, Aoife retrieved Victoria's slip of paper. It too was stained with the enemy's blue blood, and her dirty fingertips helped none as she turned it out to face the writer. On it, in cursive, was the question, "How do you kill death?" Llewellyn wasn't killed. He committed suicide. I saw it. He overstepped, and he wanted repentance. But try as they might, they could not kill him. "Don't you see?" she said. "This is happening because you lot think you're gods. Despite your halos, you have no divinity whatsoever." She tried, at least. Again, Victoria did not speak a word to her. Her continued silence was, at least to the immortal detective, as close to an admission of guilt as an intrinsic witch could achieve. It was not enough. It was nowhere near closure, and it was making her angry. Aoife didn't have the chance to continue her admonishment, though, as Thanatos Mercy stood to her feet. She had her eyes fixed on the twilight's horizon, perhaps considering the time it would take the sun to rise and to end all of this. They did not move from it, even as, at her muted command, the miscellaneous wooden debris around her turned into a fine dust and created a path from where she was standing to the gaping hole in the stonework. Then she spoke these words. "They need to be cured," she said, softly, motherly, "not culled." And with that out in the open, Mercy stepped over the threshold and vanished downwards towards the fight. Aoife just sort of stood there for a minute, with her mouth wide open like an exhausted dog. She was tapping Victoria's shoulder in disbelief and pointing in the direction of the hole like, "Did you see that shit right there?" Victoria smacked her hand away instinctively and followed in Mercy's wake as Aoife followed on behind. "That idiot," she said to herself as she squinted towards the flatness below. Her eyesight was not as good as the detective's, but she could likely see just as well that Mercy was slow-walking amongst the rage and the explosive violence right towards the limping king of vampires. She's going to use the heart, and we cannot allow that to happen. Come. Aoife went to say, "Come? Are you fucking..." but had only a second to react as the levitation-abled war witch flung herself out of the tower. She didn't even think. Aoife just grabbed onto the tail of Victoria's cloak and clung on for dear life as the two of them floated down to the burning quad, albeit probably with less grace than Victoria had pictured given the extra weight. It had almost definitely not occurred to her that the detective would need a lift. She probably assumed that she could just toss herself out of the window, break all her goddamn bones, and let them heal as she sorted the situation out herself. It was a real mess at ground level. The vampires had taken many lives in their siege, and despite having full bellies, a fair few of them were dry as a bone. Civilian witches held their own as best they could, but only the soldiers were able to combat the creatures at their full strength. Anyone else was just wasting their lives for naught. Thanatos Mercy had her dukes up, already surrounded by those who had fallen in near mint condition in an ancient Roman turtle formation, still moving towards her foe. Tartarus Abdul and Metis Saskia were nowhere to be seen right now, and Eduardo Kresnik had been left sitting in his own fear filth back up in the tower. Norman Kras stood a few meters out of reach, holding the heart of Sinis Nix out in his hand as if it were a chalice or a trophy of some kind. It was beginning to emit a warmth, an orange glow which, from a distance, read like candlelight. Aoife could see a small amount of smoke rising, and the expression on the king's face made it clear that it was burning him like a hot coal. Side by side, Aoife and Victoria approached the Thanatos, her undead minions parting down the middle in their company, allowing them into the meat-laced shell of the turtle. "Stand down, Mercy Van Dyke," spoke Victoria, her voice as calm as the situation would allow. "I know your intentions and I despise them. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to do this to yourself. It is clear that we cannot solve this problem with more killing," declared Mercy. "I see no other way to revert to peace, and I will not allow them all to vanish without a trace. Our forebearers have betrayed us, this much is true. The council has forced my hand. Nix's will be done." "This cannot be Nix's will, nor can it be the machinations of Salem. This is you, Mercy. You cannot take from them what makes them unique. To be stripped of an identity like that is tantamount to death," she said, amongst the rumbling rabble of the ravenous resurrected. "If I were to lose my witchhood, I would have nothing. I would not be me. I could not imagine such a punishment. Eternity on that so forsaken isle would be paradisiacal in comparison. And if I were to lose what makes me me, I would be free," Mercy argued, momentarily closing her eyes. As she composed her next words, careful not to allow them to form as natural-grown thought, Aoife swore she saw the strands of mauve light shiver and ripple. "I was a proponent of life before I was chosen, and since then, I have never been further away from it. Nix's will has no concern for what even our petty minds believe, and thus I know this is where I am destined to die myself. This is not about either of you, for God's sake," said Aoife, smacking her hands against the both of their backs. "Look around you. This needs to be dealt with now. Our priority should be the safety of Nomi Grimarsi. Where the fuck is the Kronos? I swear, you witches are just as bad as the Kresniks. You'll kill these poor fuckers, but you won't stop them, will you? I need..." Aoife was cut off, as usual. This time, however, it was by a light so blinding that she fell over backwards. It was followed swiftly by an immense crackling, as if Mother Earth had shifted over restlessly in her sleep. In the unbearable whiteness, Aoife swore she could see a pattern, not unlike hexagonal honeycombs, burned into her retinas. A fallout of energy blew over her as the shine settled down, and it caused Nabirius to stir something awful. They could detect the aforementioned will of Sinis Nix, who was known across the filter as the Remnant, Belphegor, the firstborn to the All-Mother, and the embellisher of calamity. If only for a second, as if the heart itself was a direct line to this immeasurably powerful creature, Aoife heard the call connect. By instinct, to save herself from being trampled by the Thanatos' temporarily blinded zombies, Aoife leapt to her feet and sprinted towards the action, despite knowing that she would have been little to no help in the impending final battle. She was too slow. Victoria and Mercy had already made their move by the time her vision was back to 100%. Victoria held Norman's arm outstretched, only just holding him back from piercing his own heart with Sinise Nix's own, and Mercy held him back from behind, jamming her forearm into his throat in a headlock. What had earlier been only a harmless black rock was now beating between the king's fingers. 7 angular and jagged blades, about twice as long as fingers, had spawned from its core like a many-taloned claw. It was with these that one could initiate the sacrifice required to grant their deepest desire. "You continue to surprise me," Victoria grunted, gesturing with her head for Aoife to take the stone from him as soon as possible. "I had not imagined you were truly willing to give yourself to this plot. I did not believe your ego left room for altruism." "I am the king," he spluttered, desperate for control as he struggled against their combined power. "And my folks have suffered for far too long for me to put myself ahead of them, even for a second. All this will be worthwhile when my people can bask in the light of day once more without the fear of being forgotten. You have shown me that immortality can be a curse. That curse is circumstantial. I will not falter." Tough as his words might have been, Aoife still did as she was told. As she leant towards him, remaining as casual and as collected as she could in such a situation, the king of vampires made his move. He became semi-transparent, turning into straight mist from the waist down, and he slipped from the grasp of both witches. Obviously, the heart fell unguarded, but just for a second. Norman was quick enough and skilled enough, however, to reconstitute himself altogether underneath it so that the heart could land right in the palm of his hand. Pallas Victoria was no sloth, and she would be made a fool of no longer. She saw it happen in real time, saw him bite down on his lip as if telegraphing his movement, and she was ready for it. A knife hand strike, blessed by some grand buffing spell, carved through his wrist like a hot, righteous axe head with only a little resistance. A trail of sparks and fizzles followed her swing like the tail of a comet, and it sent both the heart and the hand attached to it spinning to the left out of anyone's immediate reach. Following through with her free hand, Victoria attempted to subdue the king with another golden Ocnus rope, allowing Mercy to collect the artifact against the former's wishes. Aoife saw her going for it, and her first thought was her implied loyalty to Victoria, their strained relationship a strong one still. Part of her, though, suspected that Mercy was, in fact, the answer to this unending, unbalanced equation. The heart of Sinise Nix had landed between 2 sorry, limp corpses. One witch, missing much of their middle between the exposed ribcage and the pelvis, and one vampire, with both head and heart eradicated. Mercy was not playing any games now. That said, she didn't look confident in what she was about to do. Her brow was furrowed, and it appeared a light bulb had popped on above her head. Retrieving the item from the purple fusion of fluids, Mercy changed strategies and commanded the deceased witch to rise from their rest, her puppet strings extending from her fingertips, piercing through their shoulder blades and pulling the 2 halves together, shorter and stouter than they had been in life. They rose then, as if thrust top first by a series of pulleys. No time to waste on this experiment. Mercy slammed the heart into the witch's chest, to which they made no immediate reaction. They felt no pain, being dead and all. Hard to say whether they actually came back, or if it was really just some kind of puppetry. "Sinise Nix, I call upon you," came the words from Mercy's lips, only to be parroted by the gurgling gob of the innocent dead. "I demand you remove from this world to be yours the cursed vampirism of the Saint Aoife." The heart seemed not to react to Mercy's sudden and dramatic change in intentions. It cast not the proponent piece of the ritual into hot ash, but instead pushed itself from the hollow soma as if it were rejected body jewelry. "Well," said Aoife, "it was worth a shot, mate." A huff of exertion and possibly exhaustion came rushing in like wind as the king of vampires pushed a whole new arm through his wounded stump, fully formed, grey in colour, and as monstrous as his transformed brethren. It was far more efficient than Aoife's own regeneration, as if the saint-borne vampires' human form was separate from their truest form, and that one could be shed for the other on demand, like a shark's teeth. Quite rapidly, the change in colour started spreading across his body, replacing skin with sporadic scales. As he passed the point of no return, Norman Craw looked like a different species of vampire altogether, as if his regality made him truly special in some way. His ears, for instance, had an additional, taller point in the middle, which turned the threatening V into a furious W. Alongside developing tusk-like fangs, the rest of his teeth too became pointed and serrated like the blades of a wood chipper, crooked and moving independently. Featherless, fleshy protrusions stretched out from beneath his shoulder blades, more like oversized fingers than the wings they were intended to resemble. And there was new muscle definition all across him that did not exist on the body that had preceded it. Norman was now a head or two taller, standing on his gnarled, mutated toes, and had even grown a prehensile tail, which slammed hard enough behind him when it sprouted that it left cracks in the cobblestone. Not only were these changes physical, but the king's speed had increased tenfold, for by the time Aoife had come to terms with his new appearance, Norman had already struck Thanatos Mercy in the chest, thundering her across the courtyard as if she weighed fuck all soaking wet. Norman was snarling, proper bestial, foaming blue at the mouth. He'd clearly lost all sense and capability of speech. His brow bone had thickened and was arching over his eyes like a goddamn Neanderthal. It would have been a surprise to hear that he could see anything like that, and wasn't just echolocating them like the bat he actually hardly resembled at all. He was all teeth and hard edges now. As such, he was having difficulty actually finding the stationary heart. Victoria acted as quick as she could, her first instinct firing her right in the monster's direction and, like a European midfielder, booted the heavy heart into the waiting goalie grip of Aoife Sheridan. It cost Victoria much of her consciousness, as the monster soon knocked her one in the jaw, and she was pummeled into a small stone dent. As it always seemed to be in these situations, the decisive action fell on her. Mercy was back on her feet, albeit limping, and signaling in silence that she was open and ready to do now what must be done. All eyes, even those half closed in a force crater, were on Strangelove. Time slowed, and even then she had little time to think about what exactly she was about to do. Norman Craw, king of vampires, made his move. Bent at the knees, fists clenched, ready to very possibly punch a hole clean through Aoife's chest cavity. The heart of Sinis Nix was made airborne the moment that the king's first foot left the ground. Norman now moved too fast to be seen properly, but that didn't matter because her part in this scheme was over and done with before he even knew what he'd set into motion. Aoife felt only the sudden, searing chill of his flesh on hers like freezer burn, or rather, his flesh protruding through hers. Aoife's estimate was on point. Now Norman's arm was wedged between her broken ribs, coming all the way out through the other side, where, between his spiraling fingernails, was her own needless heart and a piece of her spinal cord. It hurt like all fuck. It hurt enough for her to wonder if this would be what killed her, finally. It hurt like it would never actually heal, although, even in shock, Naberius was fine to tell her that even this wasn't enough to do her in. Had she not been held up by her attacker, Aoife would have already collapsed, but his subtle rummaging kept her awake and in pain. It was over, though. "Tough luck, Dracula," spluttered Aoife, as Thanatos' mercy burst into a hectic inferno despite the raging protests of her co-counselor. It lasted all but 15 seconds, and when the blaze subsided, there was nothing of her left over to bury. Norman Craa, now king of nothing at all, retrieved his limb from inside Aoife Sheridan's skeleton. It came out human, and the rest of him returned in the same fashion that it had first changed. Aoife fell to the ground and would not be woken again for several weeks. What happened after that point, to her, was uncertain, standing somewhere between hearsay and anecdotal evidence provided at the trial she would later face. Suddenly seriously lacking in supernaturality, Norman Craa screamed for the loss of his personhood, at the loss of what made him more than just a man. His cohorts, those who had not been oft in the matter of combat, howled along with him in a kind of saddened sonata, but it did not last all night. In fact, it lasted only as long as the flames of mercy did. For Norman Craa died, then and there. Every single one of them died, one by one at first, and then the rest all at once. By sunrise, the saint-borne vampires were little more than a disastrous legend, ridding them of their curse, or rather, their saint's blessing as they might have seen it, rid them of their everything, and left husks behind to be buried at sea. For this, Aoife Sheridan faced the Intrinsic Council sans 2 months later, after she had recovered from wounds sustained in battle. It was evident from the get-go, in that same room that had housed Norman Craa's last-ditch effort, that she was to be ousted from the Island of Witches, never to set foot inside the Nomi Grimarsi archive again, no matter the years she'd lived and worked amongst them, or the amount of times she'd saved their skin. Aoife Sheridan was the scapegoat here. No intrinsic witch considered their own sins, or the sins of their fathers that had brought the saint-borne vampires to this point in the first place. No, it had all been calculated while she slept, to save face, and, in all honesty, fuck 'em. Aoife Sheridan had a home in Ireland, one that she had earned from the witches in the line of duty, and she had not stepped inside it for years now. She could go freelance and actually maybe make some kind of difference outside of that so secluded island. She'd be bitter for a long, long time, but better in the long run. The witches were no good to her, not one bit. Not even her friend stood up for her, not even Palace Victoria. She'd just been silent the entire time. They called themselves gods, but knew not how to act like one. It was not her fault. How could either of them have known? This was the exact opposite of what they wanted. She was goddamn heartbroken about it. Annihilation was the very thing they were trying to avoid, and yet the Intrinsic Council all acted as though they would never have suggested such a thing. Thanatos Mercy Van Dyke, certainly didn't know. In fact, had she lived to see the results of her sacrifice, she'd have killed herself all over again. You have been listening to Should We Just Kill All the Vampires? The complete series. Originally published in 2023. Written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2026 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you like this show, you might like chucking me a buck on patreon.com/sbda, or buying a digital zine at sbda.itch.io. Please visit us on the web at carefulthere'sbones.com for more surreal stories. Have a good night.